Hello and welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma. So before I start, I just have a little announcement to make. For the past year, I've been putting out one episode per week. But for a while, I'm not going to be able to do that. At the moment, I'm quite busy, including with teaching commitments. So after today's episode, they're going to come out once every 2 weeks. And we'll see how that goes. So today's talk is about the practice of meditation, and it's about a list that comes up in Buddhist teachings called the factors of awakening. So this is about a sequence of steps that leads us towards equanimity. So in other words, they lead us to a place of steadiness and resilience. And we're training ourselves so that equanimity arises naturally and easily. So this training is based on the idea that one of the things that we do when we practice meditation is to train ourselves to handle all of the ups and downs. So from the very smallest irritations to the greatest sorrows, everything in between. And we're training ourselves to meet them with an open heart. So in the early scriptures in the Pali Canon, there's only a couple of teachings that actually contain instructions for meditation. And one of them is the Satipatthana Sutta, the teaching on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And this includes these factors of awakening, these 7 factors. And that's what I want to talk about today. So if the factors of awakening are present, then meditation is going to be much easier. So this is a framework. It's a useful map of the territory. And as a framework, it tells us whether or not we're on the right track. It tells us whether we're leaning towards awakening. And each factor is something that arises naturally, especially when we create the conditions that allow it. But these factors are also something that we can apply consciously. It's something that we can cultivate, so we can actually decide to do them. Now the list starts with mindfulness, and then after mindfulness there are 3 energizing factors, 3 calming factors. And the distinction between energizing and calming factors is quite important here. I've spoken before about the balance of energy and effort in meditation, and how some of the hindrances require us to step up the energy, and then there's others where we need to lower the amount of energy. There's an excess of energy. And I want to get into that in a bit more detail. But I want to start by saying that even though this takes some skill, meditation is a skill, it's very doable. We can all do it. An application of the right kind of effort and the right level of energy just requires some practice. And of course, as human beings, we do have the capacity to learn new skills. And every day, throughout the day, our bodies and minds carry out tasks that if we actually broke them down would be highly complex. And we just do them. We usually just do them even without having to think about them. So whether we're walking or driving or cooking or even lifting up a cup to take a drink, these are tasks that require some precise movements, exactly the right application of force and so on. And we've been practicing these things for so long that they're naturalized. So the first time you try and drive a car, for example, there's a whole lot of things to think about at the same time. You've got to think about the clutch and the gears and the brakes and the mirror and so on, the steering wheel. And after a while, we just do it. And it's exactly the same with meditation. So the skilled application of effort and energy in the right direction just comes much more naturally with practice. And it takes time. And it's not realistic to think that we'll master this straight away on day 1. But when we've been practicing for long enough, we actually learn to respond to whatever arises with some skill. So another metaphor that might be helpful when we're getting on to talk about the factors of awakening is if you imagine a tradesperson with a set of tools, and they pick the right tool that's needed in any given moment and they apply it skillfully. It's the same with meditation. So sometimes it's appropriate to focus the attention on a very narrow aspect of experience. And sometimes it's helpful to open it up wide and just take everything in, all the feelings and sounds and everything. With anger and ill will, sometimes we counteract that by practicing kindness and friendliness and compassion or forgiveness. But there's other times when we need to simply feel what we're feeling. And we can maybe just look into it, investigate it a little bit before we try and do anything about it. So in meditation, we experiment, we play, we learn. And I think there's times when actually thinking about it, conceptual thinking can be really helpful. But at other times, I think it's much more helpful to turn the attention just to simple awareness of the body sensations, just bring it all back to the body. And there's times when it's just best to give up trying to meditate, maybe go for a walk instead or something, do something different. So the point here is to be willing to adjust and adapt depending on what's needed. So going back to the metaphor of the tradesperson, this is our toolkit, 7 factors of awakening. And they are mindfulness, investigation, energy or determination, we sometimes say, joy or rapture, tranquility, concentration or collectedness, and equanimity. And I just want to run through briefly today how they fit together. So the list begins with mindfulness and it ends with equanimity. And mindfulness and equanimity are really the bookends. Mindfulness is fundamental. It lets us know whether any of the 7 factors, including mindfulness itself, is present or not. And equanimity, which is sometimes referred to as the unshakable deliverance of the heart, that's the goal. That's what we're doing this for. And the cultivation of these 7 factors, these 7 awakening factors, does the actual heavy lifting, does the work of releasing our afflictive moods. And all of the factors support each other and they won't necessarily arise in the same order. So going back to the beginning, we start with mindfulness. We start with sati, if you want to use the Pali word. Mindfulness is much more than just simple awareness. So mindfulness actually incorporates knowing and remembering, but with an element of wisdom, an element of positivity, an element of friendliness. So you could call it wakefulness in its broadest sense. And of course, an important element of mindfulness is just simply knowing what's happening in this moment. But there's also a protective element to it. There's a kind of protective awareness in mindfulness. So it sees, but it also protects us from impulses that overwhelm us. So mindfulness is the factor of awakening that really catalyzes all of the other ones. And it naturally leads to the arising of curiosity, which brings us to the next factor, which is investigation. If you want to use the Pali, it's Dhammavichaya. So the Buddha talked a lot about investigation, and in this context, investigation simply means getting up close to our lived experience and being curious. Our awareness of our bodies and our minds can often be quite blocked. Mindfulness and investigation actually opens us up to what's going on in the present moment. And that way, any experience, whatever it is, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, becomes an opportunity for awakening, for practice. So whatever comes up, whatever arises, even stress or anger or back pain or anything, when we're really aware of it and we're interested in it and we're ready to look at it and ready to learn, then that's when the quality of investigation is actually there. Getting interested in our present moment experience actually generates our next factor, which is energy. Now the Pali word is virya. It's often translated as energy, but you could also translate it as effort, or strength, or courage, or enthusiasm. It arises as a result of us being interested. So virya doesn't describe raw energy or raw effort, it's actually applied energy. So like the toolkit I spoke about just now, it's used with some skill. And I've heard it described before in terms of a formula, which is interest plus intention plus attention plus effort, gives us virya. And some teachers like to emphasize the kind of heroic warrior-like element of virya. I don't know whether that's a metaphor that you find helpful or not, but I do think the idea of the warrior conveys something that goes beyond just effort. It suggests a degree of courage, a degree of willingness to stay with difficult and painful feelings sometimes. It can often feel quite unsafe. And virya is about our willingness to stand rather than flee and to embrace some of the discomfort that we experience. As the teacher Pema Chodron says, even if for 1.6 seconds we sit with that restlessness, when yesterday we couldn't sit for even 1 second, that's the journey of the warrior. So energy then supports the next factor, which is joy. Piti is the word in Pali, P-I-T-I. Piti arises when we take delight in meditation, when we enjoy it. It's a kind of refined enjoyment. It's appreciating the quality and the process of being present. So Piti really describes joyful interest. So at this point, we're not having to force ourselves to meditate. We're not having to force ourselves to let go of obsessive thinking. It's just falling away by itself. And with Piti, we're much less inclined to look for distraction. And the monk Ajahn Brahm uses the term the beautiful breath, which may resonate for you. If you ever have this in your practice, Piti, it's like an energy that's associated with very deep concentration states. We can often feel this kind of energy in the body. But it's also about everyday joy. It's also about the joy that naturally arises in our lives. So, for example, the joy of being connected to the people around us is piti. So inwardly generated joy occurs when we're momentarily freed from the hindrances, and it shows us there's nothing missing. There's nothing missing. Our happiness doesn't have to depend on conditions being exactly the way we want them to be. It can come from inside us. And we can't contrive joy, we can make room for it, we can't force it. As the emotional intensity of joy starts to fade, it leads us to the next factor, which is tranquility. And the word in Pali is passaddhi, which is also translated as calm or ease or serenity. Tranquility is the first of the pacifying factors, and it starts to balance out the arousing factors. So meditation practice can often be associated with a lot of turbulence, and tranquility is what happens when the turbulence starts to calm right down. So it's not quite the same as reducing stress. Tranquility actually in this context means a mental, emotional stillness. It's a connection with the peace and the spaciousness that's always there when we're not stirring everything up. And that's there, it's always there in the background. We lose sight of it quite a lot of the time, most of the day. But that capacity for peace and stillness is always there. And the best description of tranquility I've ever found comes from this poem by Ryakan. And it goes, "My hut lies in the middle of a dense forest. Every year the green ivy grows longer. No news of the affairs of men, only the occasional song of a woodcutter. The sun shines and I mend my robe. When the moon comes out, I read Buddhist poems. I have nothing to report, my friends. If you want to find the meaning, stop chasing after so many things." Then tranquility naturally leads to samadhi, which is the next factor. Samadhi is often translated as concentration or collectedness, and it's a factor that supports the arising of wisdom. So when the mind is really steady, it can see more clearly, and the insights go deeper. They're much more experiential rather than just concepts. Removing distractions really brings power to the mind. It really sharpens the mind. It gives us a sense of well-being, but also the mind is no longer being pushed around by the pleasant or the unpleasant. And the hindrances, to all intents, are absent. The mind becomes very stable and very steady, very strong, has a great deal of capacity. And this settled, unified state, which again is achievable by all of us, is something very well worth practicing for. And then that brings us to the last factor, which is equanimity. And the word in Pali is upekkha. And equanimity means standing in the midst of everything, all events, all experiences, with just unshakable balance. And it's not to be confused with not feeling or not having any more emotions. We're not trying to get rid of our emotions. We're not trying to become beige. Equanimity is not a cold place, it's steadiness rather than indifference. And equanimity doesn't leave everything else behind. It's not about separating ourselves off. In fact, it's quite the opposite, really. Equanimity exists right in the middle of experience. So the sequence of the factors of awakening lead that way. They lead us towards equanimity, towards steadiness, and this is a gradual path. And we'll go through all of the factors again and again in our practice. And as I said before, it's not always necessarily that they come up in the same order. Equanimity here is both something to cultivate as we go along, but it's also a goal of practice. And it's something that we can all experience, even if it's often brief. So coming back to the center, coming back to being balanced again and again, actually is a very, very good skill, a very useful skill. It points us towards awakening. And if that becomes a natural inclination, then it's something that protects us. It's something that protects us from our own reactivity, from our own minds. So that's this week's episode, and thank you, as always, for listening. See you again in 2 weeks' time.